Hey, this is the Body Punch Podcast, and my name is Naz. Let's talk about what's next for Conor McGregor and Dustin Poirier. We've talked about this fight on the live stream of this podcast. If you haven't seen that, I give, right after the fight, I give a reaction to UFC 264 and the doctor stoppage of Conor McGregor against Dustin Poirier. This was a very weird one. We talked about this in that post-fight podcast that we did. And in that podcast, I was just thinking to myself, no one could have predicted this. But then I also had the thought that nobody goes into fights thinking that this would be the end of a trilogy, or so it may seem. The reason why I wanted to make this podcast was to dive a little deeper on the aftermath of the Conor McGregor and Dustin Poirier fight. Now, let's start from the beginning. And when they walked into the ring, they both walked to the center of the octagon. Conor McGregor eager to start the fight. Dustin Poirier looked like he was calm, cool, and collective and belonged in this moment, with Conor McGregor staring him down. Now, Conor went back to some of his regular stances that he used in the past, but what I noted in the fight was in some moments, Conor McGregor was going back to the second fight and using the more boxing stance that he had in that one. Now, it was a mixture of all of the things that we've seen from him in the past. We've seen him use that more karate style, more bladed style, if you will, and then he mixed it up with the more boxing style. With Dustin Poirier, what I noticed with him, he was just trying to analyze the moment. And at one part of the fight, near the end of it, which it ended in the first round, as we all know, Dustin Poirier was getting Conor McGregor in a couple of shots on the feet. But where Conor McGregor made the error in so many people's eyes was he saw an opportunity for a guillotine choke. Now, his coach, Conor McGregor, said in an interview with Laura Sanko that they drilled that choke many times. But what happened was it was a standing choke that they envisioned. And Conor McGregor let his back touch the ground and he went full in. He put in all the chips for this choke. And unfortunately, but fortunately to Dustin Poirier, having his black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, he was able to evade the choke, and Dustin Poirier just started piecing him up on the ground. Now, at that point, Conor McGregor got back up, and we saw where his foot eventually broke. More of a little bit higher than his ankle. It was fibula and tibula, something like that, which both broke. So at the end of that, Conor McGregor is on the ground and he says a bunch of stuff to Dustin Poirier and his wife, as we all heard. Many people were astonished / surprised, but we have to imagine what Conor McGregor is going through while he's on the ground with his legs snapped in half. And he did not expect something like this would happen to him. You always I talked about this in the post-fight podcast. I'm going to refer to that a lot, but that was my initial thoughts. But you see this a lot nowadays, but it wasn't common at one point. And I'm talking about the leg break here. We've seen it in Chris Weidman and Anderson Silva, who both Chris Weidman did it to Anderson Silva. Weidman had it happen to him, and you see them come back, and we haven't seen Chris Weidman come back from this brutal injury. But we saw Anderson Silva come back, and the commentators did talk about that one at the end of the fight, which I thought was a good callback. But they talked about his boxing fight with Junior, and he looked great in that fight. But if you look at what he looked like right after, I'm talking about the Adesanya fight, I'm talking about the other fights, I believe the Michael Bisping fight, he did not look like the same Anderson Silva that took out Forrest Griffin. He did not look like the same Anderson Silva that blasted onto the scene. This injury does do something. This is in a different spot than the two previous men that I talked about. But Conor McGregor was really going at it against Dustin Poirier. And this is the main thing that I wanted to talk about in this podcast, was what's next for both of these fighters. Now, Conor McGregor had his surgery. I'm recording this on July the 12th. And he had his surgery. Looks like it was a success. He was really happy about it. And he was talking about making an eventual comeback. Now, who will that be against? Who knows? But Dana White did mention that he is looking for a fourth fight between these two guys, which surprised a lot of us, surprised me. And it's just it's a very difficult call, because in many people's eyes, Dustin Poirier was able to best Conor McGregor in 2 of the 3 fights. And it's sad to say, or it's hard to say, this could have been the best thing that happened to Conor McGregor. Meaning that a leg break, instead of getting knocked out or submitted, might be a little bit better, because it happened to him. He did it himself, some could say, or, it was a freak injury. It was the freak of freak injuries. I think that's a better way of saying it. And so Conor can still put out that narrative that this guy didn't beat me. My leg snapped in half. There's nothing I can do about this. So that's why I think in Dana White's eyes, even in Dustin Poirier, he said that he wants to fight Conor McGregor again. And obviously Conor McGregor and his mentality forces him to want to get this fight back. But here's the kicker, that Dustin Poirier is fighting for the belt next. He's fighting Charles Oliveira for that 155-pound strap. So how do I think that's going to work out? I think that Conor still needs to get another fight. I listened to the Luke Thomas podcast, and he mentioned on the morning podcast, morning combat podcast, he mentioned that maybe an RDA fight might be next for Conor McGregor, just to have something to jump back at Dustin Poirier against. Now, Conor McGregor has been chirping RDA throughout this whole lead up. We saw it in the weigh-ins, and I'm assuming there was a lot more to that than we saw in all the behind the scenes video and all that kind of stuff. So we do have the RDA fight that Conor McGregor could have. Dustin Poirier is obviously going to fight for the belt. And if Dustin Poirier wins, which I think many people are just saying that Dustin Poirier is going to win, but Charles Oliveira is a person that clawed tooth and nail for that belt. He did everything that he could to get that belt. And he deserves that. Not that any other 155er didn't deserve it, but he's a real tough test for anybody. Even if you're Dustin Poirier, even if you're the number one contender like he is, it's a tough test. There's a lot of things that Charles Oliveira could nullify in Dustin Poirier's game. I see the jiu-jitsu being nullified. They're both high-level jiu-jitsu practitioners. Dustin Poirier might have the boxing edge, but we've seen Charles Oliveira do some special stuff in that octagon. So what I think is next, and I don't think many people are talking about it, is exactly what I mentioned before. Maybe Conor McGregor could fight RDA. Maybe he could fight Nate Diaz, but I think Nate Diaz is when you're pulling the ripcord and it's your exit parachute, it's almost over. I think Conor McGregor is saving that for his last hurrah, which I don't think this is for him. We've seen Chris Weidman already start walking and driving, and he's exercising. And his fight was a little while ago. It wasn't too long. And he already looks like he's able to walk around. Obviously, he needs crutches every once in a while. You don't want to put too much pressure on that leg. But Conor McGregor has the best doctors in the world. He has the best people looking at his leg. And I think that with best case scenario, maybe he could come back in a year. This is obviously a bone break is no good, and it didn't look good at all, especially when he put pressure back on the leg and it bent backwards. It did not look good at all. But the thing is that, and this is another thing that I'm going to steal from Luke Thomas and from the podcast there, is that this could be maybe a good thing for Conor McGregor to light an extra fire under him. But take no credit away from Dustin Poirier. What he did in that fight when he was able to get on top of Conor McGregor and beat him down with some punches, that was special. That shows you why he's the number one contender, number one guy in most people's eyes for that 155-pound belt. Some people believe that belt is just kind of waiting there for him. He's the one that really deserves it. Now, what I was going to say is that what Dustin Poirier did to Conor McGregor just shows me that he might be a little bit above his level. But what Conor McGregor is kind of going to do in this, and what a lot of people are going to say, is that we didn't get the full Conor. I think that at the beginning of the fight, Conor was just going as fast as possible, throwing as many kicks, using those kicks to move Dustin Poirier in certain positions. And he does this. He doesn't use the kicks to usually knock people out. We've seen it before where he has head kicked, knocked out people, but he uses them more of a matador moving the bull in the direction that they want them to go in, so he can use his devastating left hand and just boxing in general. But Dustin Poirier stayed calm, cool, and collective. I think that was the main thing that I took away from this, aside from the skills that he displayed on the ground, the levels of jiu-jitsu that he displayed. Aside from that many people over there were rooting for the USA fighters. And then when Conor McGregor comes out, many people, and these were the same people, they were rooting for Conor McGregor. For that to happen, for all those people in attendance and all the celebrities and everybody. Cody Garbrandt was talking about it on Brennan Schaub's podcast, the live stream that they did. But you notice these celebrities in the crowd. You notice all these famous people. You notice all the people just staring at you in general. This is not something that you can ignore. In that podcast, he was talking about how he saw Gordon Ramsay in the background, and he's just like, whoa, like Gordon Ramsay's here. And could you imagine Donald Trump sitting there watching you fight Conor McGregor? Just the levels of pressure and the levels of the calmness that he showed was just spectacular. And how Dustin Poirier has evolved as a fighter has been amazing to watch. And it's one of the great stories of this era of the UFC, is to watch Dustin Poirier take that defeat from Conor McGregor. It was a devastating loss, but it was, on top of that, it was very emotional loss because of the smack talk that they had against each other. And Dustin Poirier admitted it himself that he took it to heart a bit, and it might have gone into his head. But for him to come back and defeat Conor McGregor 2 times is just nothing short of spectacular. And it's going to be great to see him fight for the belt. It's going to be good to see Conor McGregor back. Hopefully he comes back. But one last point I'll say is that Conor McGregor and his coach did say that they had a spectacular training camp. Coach Kavanaugh was talking with Laura Sanko, again, to the previous podcast that I was referring to, or the interview, that they had an amazing training camp. there was no lull in Conor McGregor's attention. They tried a different strategy when it comes to this. When it came to this camp, it was just they said it was a great one, and this was a freak injury that might have been lingering. I think they got an MRI on it before the fight itself, and they weren't able to find anything, but still they believe that this is a lingering injury that Conor's been dealing with for a while, and it's very tough to see, and it's hard to imagine that someone could come back from something like this. But we've seen it before, like I mentioned, and it's a tough watch because you don't expect this in the superstars. When's the last time? Well, first of all, no one's been at the caliber of Conor McGregor's star power, but we haven't seen this in a champion. We haven't seen this in big time fights like this. We've seen this in, the Anderson Silva fight that we talked about, and we saw this in the Chris Weidman fight. That one was I think it was the third fight to the last on the main event, or it might have been a co-main event, but we haven't seen this at this level. Can you imagine the amount of people that were watching this, the casual fans, all the hardcore fans? I've been walking up and down the street and just listening to people. Someone was talking about Greg Hardy the other day, and Greg Hardy and Tai Tuivasa. I would have never thought that they would be talking about that fight. I mean, it was a spectacular knockout by Tai Tuivasa, but it's just so crazy that this fringe sport, so many people are talking about it. People were talking about the Gilbert Burns fight. I was eating at a restaurant and people were talking about the Conor McGregor fight, obviously, and people were talking about the Sean O'Malley show that he put on. A lot of people watched this fight, this whole fight card, and for that to be the ending, it was just brutal. And we haven't seen it on that level. And the UFC is totally fine with showing that replay over and over again. And then when Joe Rogan went and interviewed Conor McGregor, it's a tough one to see because the guy's in so much pain, and for him to get a mic shoved in his face, Coach Kavanaugh, Conor McGregor's coach, did not like that at all. But if there's one person to put a mic up against while he's against the cage, it might just be Conor McGregor. You don't want to make these rules for certain fighters, but at the end of the day, we want to hear what he's got to say. And he was still selling the fight, even though I do believe he did cross the line in the remarks that he had against Dustin Poirier's wife. And when you bring family into this, Dustin Poirier repeatedly talked about this in the post-fight press conference, but some of the stuff that Conor was saying, it was not only bad for Dustin Poirier to hear, but I think it might have been bad for Conor McGregor's family. Obviously, they support Conor McGregor 100%, but imagine being the family back home, seeing your husband, seeing your kid get their legs snapped in half, and now he's talking like this to another man's wife. It was just hard to watch. There was a mixture of other past UFC champions that I've heard this being like. I heard this could have been like the Tyron Woodley fight against Vicente Luque in the way that the fight actually played out. This might have been a little bit of Ronda Rousey mixed into it in the way that she acted before the fight. Conor did still do a bunch of interviews, and he was more than he was very available with his time. But I'm just mentioning what other people are talking about, and it's just crazy. And again, it's just fun to hear people talking about this card, and all the conversations all over the place. It's just so amazing to hear everybody talk about it, and it's fun. The biggest part for me is just explaining the rules, what's going on, and we were talking about the doctor stoppage at the end. At the end there, Conor was screaming at the referee, screaming at Bruce Buffer to tell everybody that it was a doctor stoppage, and people were questioning, what does that mean? What does that mean? It's just fun to explain this kind of stuff. But I always love talking about it on this podcast and kind of wrapping my brain around what's going on in the MMA world. We got a fun fight card next week or this weekend. Makachev, and it's going to be a good one. We're going to talk about that one. But I just wanted to wrap this one up and just dissect what's going on after we got a little bit more information. So I wanted to just hop on the podcast, talk about it a little bit. It's just fun chatting about this kind of stuff. I really appreciate you guys listening. I really appreciate you taking the time and listening to me talk about Conor McGregor and Dustin Poirier. If you could like, subscribe, hit the bell notification on YouTube, that would be highly appreciated. Leave a comment below. Let's talk about this. Let's go back and forth. Let me hear what you got to say. If you're listening to this on the different podcast networks, that's amazing. And if you could, that would be amazing as well. If you could hit 5 stars, give a review. We can also talk on Apple Podcasts. That would be cool too. And wherever you listen to this, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your day. This has been the Body Punch Podcast. My name is Naz. Bye.